the time when Korea and Taiwan began the industrial policy focus, they actually targeted the global economy because they also had very small economy. Their per capita income lower than Malaysia, now 3 times more than us, which is why we are now classified as a country by the World Bank in the middle income trap.
As a central bank, Bank Negara is always carefully adjusting interest rates to maintain economic stability and keep inflation in check. It's a delicate balance, but an essential one for a healthy economy.
Now, Professor, earlier you mentioned that Bank Negara Malaysia maintains the OPR at 3%, whereby interest rates are to curb inflation and central banks raises interest rate oftentimes. Now, Prof, how is this being done and what is the frequency?
The point that I made just now is that Malaysia is a small economy, highly integrated in the global economy. If you're a closed economy, yes, it will have a direct bearing on inflation. If you raise interest rates, you actually raise savings, there will be less money in circulation. And less money in circulation means lower inflation rates. But because Malaysia is highly integrated, it means that the impact of raising interest rates to lower inflation will be that much less. The second thing is the choice the central bank has here in relation to its capacity to control the national economy is that much less, not the way Jerome Powell is doing it in the US. Now, it has to really be confident that that impact would lower inflation rates. When you actually raise interest rates, you actually make cost of capital for those who are borrowing that much higher. Are you going to stimulate investment? In the typical Keynesian sense, no, you're not going to do that. Now, you also have investments which you classify as important, and where the risks are higher, the potential returns are also that much higher. Startups, for example. We are looking at new knowledge, translating into goods and services that brings you higher value-added activities, which we are hoping for. That's what NIMP4 talks about. We need to raise median household income from 2,600 ringgit in 2023 to 4,510 ringgit in 2030. For these things to happen, value-added must rise in the share of gross output. Can that happen? These are questions typical monetary economists don't answer. You need to have all of them sitting together, and if it means that the general interest rates need to be high, like what President Park Chung-hee did in Korea. Korea enjoyed its highest annual average GDP growth rate between 1970 and 1979, and Park Chung-hee was short dead. Second oil crisis. He gave preferential tariffs to the chaebols, but he also made sure those enjoying preferential tariffs were meeting the targets every year. He took them out if they didn't. If they used that money, lent it in the curb market, the black market, he even put his uncle to jail. He did that. In other words, do we have that sort of governance here? No. A whole lot of people enjoy these rents, including incentives. A lot of incentives. I have never seen a real evaluation of tax exemption or tariff preference given or subsidies given, implicit subsidies by way of grants, for example. Proper evaluation to see if they are meeting targets. I never saw in Malaysia. Took place in Korea, took place in Taiwan, took place in Japan. Now, if these things are done in such a way, then you can say something about how interest rates are governed by the central bank. As it is now, central bank's role is seen as good because quite clearly it was not manipulating through the use of interest rates to see that we are propping up trade surplus. Although our trade surplus have been rising, even including the US, it's already in the danger zone, but the 3 criteria they have, one of which is whether central bank is manipulating through either the use of interest rates or otherwise which includes printing money. It's not doing that. So my answer to that question will be, should they be intervening? My own feeling is, if you look at the CEOs making massive amount of money, the CEOs of these banks, not necessarily the banking officers, and yet it's fairly strong. In the end, the role of a central bank, the role of the commercial banks, merchant banks and so on, is to help support a country's development. It's not about a certain group of people making money and others not. Especially so when this happened in Germany. Hilferding wrote about that. When you leave it to finance capital to take charge, they would like to make more and more money. It actually squeezed manufacturing, squeezed agriculture, money going to them. Now, these are things the central bank need to take account.
Now, Prof, what is the correlation between trade as well as interest rate when it comes to attracting foreign capital?
It's indirect rather than direct in that sense, although some people run all this number crunching exercises assuming that these things are there. Now let me mention that if you're dealing with interest rates attracting money to be safe, but that interest rates would mean stifling or reducing the tendency for investors to borrow that money. If you're dealing with foreign direct investment, it's completely independent of interest rates. We are expecting more foreign direct investment, meaning investors themselves are involved in equity movements in companies. At least 10% of it, that's how the IMF defines, which you call as transnational investment or multinational investment. Now, Malaysia is actually a country where its reliance, unlike the US, the whole globe are savers there, especially those who buy treasury bills. At the moment, China and Japan still dominate the acquisition of treasury bills. We don't have that sort of situation here. Now, what it then means is that if we are dealing with interest rates themselves affecting directly, indirectly it will tend to have a negative bearing because it will discourage, higher interest rates would discourage entrepreneurs from coming in. This typically happens when you're controlling cash flows, what you call capital flight, meaning that if you are worried that lots of your money is going out to the other countries to raise interest rates for people to keep their money here. Is that the situation we face? We faced that in 97, 98, yes, because of sentiments, because of the herd behavior that was going on. We had to introduce capital controls then. Now, I don't think that's very much seen as useful now. It's unnecessary. So my own feeling is we as a market, we're not the US. We tend to look at interest rates as one that's good enough to say keep that much of money remaining here, but interest rates at the same time are there playing a role, a developmental role of supporting, oiling those guys who are out to do business. So in that sort of sense, I mean, we can't even say there's a real inverse relationship as such. When interest rates are terribly low, it's likely that people won't. At the moment, I can say interest rates in India, although I haven't seen the last 6 months or so, India actually has far lower FDI investments, even though Manmohan not only was finance minister when he started it, he was prime minister as well. It opened up India that much more, but India remains a fairly close economy, both investment-wise and trade-wise compared to us. So in that sort of scenario, I don't really see how raising interest rates would actually attract foreign investment. When we are dealing with those savers coming in, not multinationals with their own money. Besides, most electronic firms deal with trade using the dollar, which is why they were insulated during the 97-98 crisis, because it didn't have a bearing on exchange rates for them. They dealt with the dollar because these are firms importing and exporting. And they were very happy when the ringgit fell because they pay lower wages in real sense to the workforce here. If indeed you want to see structural change, Malaysia, rather than specializing in low and medium value-added activities, to move up to high value-added activities. Remember that GDP is measured by value-added.
In November 2024, Malaysia recorded a trade surplus of 15.3 billion ringgit, significantly up from 12.1 billion ringgit in November 2023.
policies that boost exports. We're talking about boosting the economic growth. How Bank Negara Malaysia or the Malaysian government plays its role?
Let me note that the fact that Malaysia is a very small economy, at a time when Korea and Taiwan began the industrial policy, they actually targeted the global economy because they also had very small economies. They had per capita income lower than Malaysia, now 3 times more than us. Until 79, Korea had a per capita income lower than Malaysia's. 80, they fell a bit because of the second oil crisis. Park Chung-hee again was shot dead by a security guard, and then went back. Now, Korea's per capita income is more than 3 times than that of Malaysia. They have over 50 million people. We have 33.6 million people. Taiwan's too has overtaken to be more than 3 times that of Malaysia's. Singapore has gone that much higher. Well, Singapore always had a higher per capita income. Now, coming back to Malaysia, if we are dealing with the sort of trade policies that we've had, liberalize, open up, let as much firms come in, somehow that logic driven by neoclassical theory, this is like manna from heaven, leave technologies to nature to take shape, which is why we are now classified as a country by the World Bank in the middle income trap. We are having a per capita income close to 12,000, but not 12,000 yet, 2023 figures. Look at the dramatic rise of China with a massive population. Also lifting more than 850 million people out of poverty from 1978's economic reforms and Deng Xiaoping to control. So my impressions of it is trade policy need to also take the dynamics of how we can achieve the goals of NIMP4, which is to raise median incomes from 2,600 per household in 2023 to 4,510 per household in 2030. At the moment, we're not achieving it because that required 6.5% per annum GDP growth rate. We haven't achieved in any of these years since 23. Now, that actually means we need to look at how we have industrial policy. I have many, in that sense, works that are published that talks about the difference between passive and active industrial policy. Here we end up enabling markets. We think this is what we should do, which the central bank did very much, which the government did very much, but in the end, we remain competitive in low and medium value-added activities, not in high value. We did not see the transition to higher value-added. We need active industrial policy in that sense in order to make this happen. Not just making big statements about we have chip design parks, we have so many years of experience, and we continue to export this, but are they in higher value-added products? If that is indeed the case, our per capita income would not have stuck below 12,000. It's not happening. So what I'm telling is you need to have active industrial policy there to see that firms are upgrading, that industrial upgrading, value-added share and gross output is continuing to rise. If you give incentives and grants because the markets are likely to fail otherwise, you must make sure they are not going to sap the economy. If we give them forever, which is what Malaysia has done, then all the guys, more and more of these non-performing guys will drive the economy. You're unlikely to succeed doing that. So you need an active industrial policy to see that that change takes place. Now, for that to take place too, if you are looking at interest rates facing the guys who are performing needs to be controlled, which is what these countries did. And now they are categorized as developed countries. So we've been talking about every now and then, we are 2020, now it's 2030, we will continue extending that. And it's not just a question of just getting that income up, because we have a World Bank office here which would like to justify its role here and say we are hitting there. But look at the main report that they put up from Washington. We are still in the middle income trap. So the point is quite clear. Let's say we've had semiconductors from 1970, effectively 1970 when National Semiconductor relocated from the US. Now, what have we done to move up? Are we in a situation where we think by, say, minimum line width, in logic chips is 2 nanometers. Although our minister says in 5 years to 10 years we will be producing our chips. I think these are nice words to hear, but are there movements in technology-wise there? I haven't seen it. I have studied extensively and published with the ERSO director before because she had the data, I had the language. Yolin was the director of Electronic Research and Service Organization. There are few papers published from Taiwan. I don't see any of that happening here. We need to have someone with a vision Like Maurice Chang, although he was born in Ningbo, Zhejiang province, he went to orchestrate the change. And there are many others who gained their tacit knowledge, not only studying in big universities in the US, Wu Tai-wan, for example. He worked at IBM. These are people with the knowledge of the vision of where semiconductors will be. Maurice Chang now has taken over the whole world as far as semiconductors are concerned. In fact, when I spoke to Wu Tai-wan, he was the Semiconductor Association president of Taiwan, he recommended this name, Loh Kin-wah, who was a Malaysian who was running Kimunda. Kimunda failed because of cash flow problems when the global financial crisis took place. We need to have that sort of guy here running the show who have proven tacit knowledge. Maurice Chang had been senior vice president of tax instrument in control of R&D, the number one firm then that TSMC overtook on logic chips, in touch with the military labs, Delphi, Bell Laboratory and so on, and in touch with the buyers and suppliers. That's the sort of vision. And he even created a new business model. What Gordon Moore had predicted, that you cannot go beyond the whole chip owned by a firm, he actually just focused with no brand name. TSMC stuff, that allowed them to become the global number one foundry, accepting contracts from Intel. They make all the sophisticated Intel work. They don't do designing. At that time, they felt to get into that, they'll be colliding with the US. They didn't do it. Now, there are 4 Taiwanese firms in chip design within the top 4 firms. Until 1990, there were no Taiwanese firms. He was advising then. So what I'm saying here is you need to have an active industrial policy. You can't just say, we bring this foreign investment, we create all this. In fact, chip design, if you ask me, the understanding I have, it's not something that's driven by scale, it's driven by scope. So you don't have to be having a park to serve all these things, which is the case in Singapore. Doesn't have the scales, but they can do chip design because there are designers in the university, there are designers in the science park that they have, the incubators that are available for them. A park itself for it, I don't see. In fact, when I gave a public lecture at Indian Institute of Management 2008 in Bangalore, there were 500 engineers who came to listen to me, from subsidiaries that include Intel, AMD, Infosys, Wipro, and so on. I simply asked them this question. I'm surprised, why do you have 12,000 employees? I don't see scale at all relevant. If you make this much, that means unit cost would go down, that scale. They totally agree with me. Because they have so much of demand for software engineering, they're just there, but there's no scale there. And therefore, there is no need for a park as such. You need a park if you are an underdeveloped area where you can't provide all this everywhere. You just focus on. That's how our special economic zones went, export processing zones. Because you cannot provide the same basic infrastructure in all parts of Malaysia. We couldn't do that. So we are creating, say, a Silicon Valley or a Route 128 in the US. We need to see networks of innovation that connect firms, including small firms, connected to public labs, government-owned, university labs, incubators and so on. So the small guy can innovate, otherwise the small guy can't, which is why Schumpeter, when he glorified the large firm, because they initiate new business cycles. They are the firms that would take the risk to have R&D, not the small guy. But the small guy's risks are now negligible because it's connected to a whole network of innovation, where they connected in such a way that small guys can innovate now. He didn't envisage it at that time. So which is why I'm making it very clear that if you are looking at making the transition, a transformation to what we are, we're languishing in this from the 70s. We moved a bit to peripheral ends of designing. The claim that we are world-class designing center doesn't exist. Even the Intel Designing Center, I was in a talk with the managing director in Penang. I'm ready to say they are not at the frontier. Now we want to see those things happen. How do you make it happen? We need to see that we upgrade our science, technology, innovation infrastructure here that coordinates with this. So it's not just the firm itself. A lot of what happens in the firm, the embedding environment is critical. The embedding environment that supports the public goods, for example. Public goods are non-excludable, non-rivalrous knowledge. Why do you need knowledge that's already created to be created again anew? The governance framework and so on must be there so that it can be used. In fact, an example I want to mention to you that I always felt is going to become a problem. The US in 1989, under the leadership of Ronald Reagan, of course he had the great supporter in Margaret Thatcher, decided to give Intel copyright, which is normally given to artisans who make paintings, who make music, what Mozart or Beethoven did. There's no part dependence. If Beethoven didn't come up with the music or Mozart, that doesn't necessarily mean it will emerge again. In part dependent science, if Einstein didn't come out with the law of relativity, it will definitely the way science is pushing. So if we stop this and say others cannot use, which is how Intel got its copyright. What has happened to Intel now? Now, what I'm saying, it actually discourages innovation. If you say this item is going to solve this problem, even though they're coming on different ways of doing it, which in the past was allowed, Intel got a copyright where even its own firm, Advanced Micro Devices, could not dislodge Intel because of the nature of that copyright agreement. So these are important to me to see how the government is looking at all this. If indeed you want to see structural change, Malaysia, rather than specializing in low and medium value-added activities, to move up to high value-added activities. Remember that GDP is measured by value-added. Gross outputs you take out, you have value-added left, constituted by wages, salaries, and profits. Now, of course, we don't want profits to completely rise faster than this, then you have inequality that much more. But it actually tells you we need to focus on that rather than getting large volumes. Very happy when FDI is there. Sometimes what we do is highly counterproductive. When it was the situation in the late 80s and early 90s, when there was lots of investment because of the Plaza Accord and various things, what we used to call economic heating taking place here. Even roads not enough, power supply not enough, we introduced independent power plants because too much of demand. So many firms were here. Poaching was rampant at that time. We made the point. Tan Sri Rafidah was the minister, MITI minister. Now we'll focus on capital-intensive investments, technology-intensive investments. But unfortunately, suddenly they saw, of course you would have expected with this, FDI levels falling, because we want those who are specializing in higher value-added activities. Suddenly they don't like these numbers. The other side say, oh, no, we bring everybody in. So everybody stayed. No serious structural transformation has taken place. Things that happened in Korea, Taiwan, Japan earlier, and in Singapore. Singapore has a different model. They have a leveraging model where FDI is used, things are conditioned, and carefully observed. But that's why in 1990 these drive firms left, because the incentives for them were not renewed. They were just simply labor intensive. Some of them hired more than 20,000 workers, came to Penang and so on, but naturally they found that we don't have much workers. They went to Thailand and other places. Seagate is just one example of that. So I think this kind of governance is necessary, rather than simply FDI is not panacea. You need to see whether that sort of firm, I'm not against it, I'm not xenophobic at all. You need them, but you want to screen to see what Singapore does, ready to do this, see that they do it, and then you attract them. Give them all the incentives that they want, but see that they implement it. An example of a firm that had to leave is TSMC 8-inch wafer fabrication in Singapore. They suddenly realized they don't have the scale. In fact, there's a chapter in one of the books where I did a chapter on Southeast Asia, on industrial hubs for Oxford University Press. That clearly states they have now decided to go on where they can have scope, economies of scope. So they're into biopharma, they're into chip design, all these things that gives them the scope, operate from small outlets, because Singapore just has that size.
Malaysia has been running on a trade surplus in recent years, which means the value of exports exceeds the value of our imports, particularly driven by key industries such as petroleum, palm oil, electronics, and machineries. This trade surplus helps Malaysia to grow its economy, strengthen its currency, and reduce debt. Stay up to date with our economy as we connect the dots on Decimal Point.